through.
Perfect.
Okay,
So,
let's
yeah,
get
so
started.
let's address some of these other things, right? Genesis chapter 11. I think this specific chapter has been misunderstood by so many Christians. A lot of people see this chapter as just someone built a tower, and then God didn't like the tower, and then
So he
God.
decides I'm gonna confuse you, so you can't finish it.
Exactly. So this is why we call it the Tower of Babel, because they're Babel. Babel means confusion, and God just simply separates them because He's just like these humans are trying to build a tower. The story is actually so much deeper, and it is so incredibly amazing when you get to the details of it. So let's go over some of the reasons why I'm saying this and why I think it's so much deeper. So I'll first give you my explanation, and then I'll give you verses so I can support this view.
Okay.
This story has nothing to do with just language. So, like, obviously it's part of it, but it has nothing to do with that in its overall sense. So, what's happening in this specific story, what's going on is, could you compare this to Genesis 10 also? And we also have to take into the context of the
What
other
was Genesis 10 again?
passages. So, Genesis 10 is so obviously it's right before this specific passage in Genesis 11, and it's about the nations, all of the nations um, that God is speaking of, right? The table of
Yeah.
nations is how the chapter is labeled, right? And it mentions like 70 nations, right? Going over these
Yeah.
types of concepts. So let's address these concepts. What's going on here? We have to remember Genesis 3 mentioned a very particular fall, which was about a serpent, which
The
by the
fall of
way
man.
was not a snake.
It was the
um,
deceiver.
let me say it this way: when an ancient reader looked at Genesis 3, none of them would have read that passage and said, "Oh, that's a
It's a
talking snake."
rattlesnake. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Nobody would have ever thought one time if they were reading any of these passages that they were going to say, "You know what? Snakes used to talk back then." The story is so much deeper than that too. So what's going on is this is a clear rebellion because the snake was a representation. Because the word is Nahash, right, which means to deceive, but we also translate it to serpent. So this was obviously a chaos creature, in which scholars will call it that. This is a creature not from this world, and this creature has come into the world to cause chaos, hence why they call it a chaos creature. They
Yeah.
use the symbol of a snake because a snake in ancient times was a scary thing. If you got bit by a snake back in those
Still is.
days, yeah, they still are, absolutely. But if you got bit by a snake back in those days, we didn't have all of the science to be able to confirm whether it was venomous or not. So everybody, when they got bit by a snake in those days, you just had to consider that, like, hey, this person's probably going to die, unless they don't,
Or
and then you find out eventually, like, oh, well, don't get bit by this kind of snake or something like that, right? But that's
yeah.
why they viewed it like that. That's why the symbol is that. So here's the interesting thing, though, as we continue going on. That's one rebellion, and then you obviously have the man, um, the fall of man in that same chapter, right?
Yeah.
Then you also have the fall of Genesis chapter 6, which as we've talked with you a little bit, it's not about fallen angels. The word angel has nothing to do with what you are. An angel is not a thing, an angel is what you do. For example,
The
I
title.
use the example of, like, if someone is a mechanic, that's what an angel is. For example, an angel is not um, something you are, it's what you do. So what does angel mean? It means a messenger. So there is no such thing as a fallen angel in that type of sense. So what happened in Genesis 6 is the sons of God, they call them that, the sons of God, came to the earth and impregnated women, and the impregnated women then gave birth to what we call Nephilim, which is what we refer to as giants. Right? So that's the second
Yeah.
thing. What are the sons of God, though? That this is going to help us to answer the Genesis 11. That's why I'm going over Genesis 3 and Genesis 6, because this is going to help us to address Genesis 11. Genesis 6, when I mentioned the sons of God, so like I was asking, what are the sons of God? What are these things? Well, the Bible gives us a very, very clear answer. In Psalm chapter 82, we are told that God is inside of his divine council. A divine council is a host of divine agents, divine beings, which the Bible calls Elohim, which is the same word used for God, by the way. And God is sitting inside of his council, his congregation, his assembly, his host, right? And he's condemning them in Psalm chapter 82. He's saying to them, you are gods, but you will all die like mere mortal men, right? So God is judging the other Elohim. Now, let me first say, I'm not claiming that there's other gods. What is the word? Let me first just this first part too. What is an Elohim? No way, I just missed 2 of those shots. An Elohim is not, we translate it as God, but really what the word means is a
Like a divine
disembodied spirit, right? It's a spirit, so in spirits do not have bodies, alright? So then this helps us answer other things too. The Nephilim.
Yeah.
Well, when an Israelite killed a Nephilim, think of David, for example, or Joshua with his conquest, which I also have a video on if anybody's interested in the question of does God command genocide? And I address this issue using Genesis 6 and other passages. But Genesis 6 and all of this gets us to the reference that this is what happens when you killed a Nephilim. The spirit of that Nephilim is what we call a demon. Okay, so now that we have this background done, now we can really address Genesis 11. So what I'm going to claim here is this. Genesis 11 is the 3rd rebellion of the other 2 rebellions that I just mentioned. Genesis 3 is a rebellion, Genesis 6 is a rebellion, and Genesis 11 is also another rebellion. What is the rebellion of Genesis 11, you may say? Well, what happens here is because of the things that I've just told you about in Genesis 3 and Genesis 11, and I mentioned Psalm 82 to support some of these other ideas, what happens here is God, his other gods, if we want to call them that, his other Elohim that have disobeyed him, and they have all been condemned. What happened is, so those specific sons of God are now locked up in Hades or Tartarus or Hell, which we refer to it. But we still have these other beings that are still causing chaos in the world. Well, this is what we call his divine council. Part of that divine council is still active in the world. This is why in Psalm 82, the writer, the psalmist, is asking God, when will you fix all of these problems, God? And then he ends the psalm by saying this. He said, this is how he ends the psalm, I believe it's verse 7. And he says, arise, O Lord, Yahweh, take back the nations that belong to you. And it's like, what do you mean, take back the nations? Well, Genesis 11 gives us the answer. And Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9. So here's the 3rd rebellion. Yahweh, after all of these other rebellions happened, he forsook the other nations of the world, on the planet, the other nations that existed, and he forsook them, as in he disinherited them. And he assigned his other Elohim, remember the divine spirits, we can call them angels just to make it so people can understand where I'm coming from. Let's call it an angel so someone understands it. But just remember, an angel is not what you are, it's a description of what you do. So, these beings, these divine council angels, right, they then became the rulers of those other nations. God allowed that. God assigned the other gods, the angels, whatever you would want to call them, to the other nations. And then what happened is these gods then rebelled, and then they also wanted the worship to them instead of worshiping the true God Yahweh. Hence why Yahweh is attempting to get all of the nations back in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is the whole point of Jesus when he says the Great Commission. It's reversing Genesis 11. The gods of the other world, the other nations, they have overtaken the world. This has led to idolatry. And,
I always thought
people,
the Tower of Babel was about like an idolatry type of thing. Like they were trying to build the
statue to show how good they were versus how good y'all was. Like to say, oh, we don't
Yeah,
need y'all,
yeah.
we can just build this tower. That type of thing.
And it's part of it. It really is. But I'm going off of Deuteronomy 32 gives us the full answer, because what happens in Deuteronomy 32 is Moses is retelling the story of Genesis 11, and Moses tells us this. So it's really amazing to see it this way. Moses retells the story, and he's describing it in Deuteronomy 32 the way that I just described. And we get this again by adding up the pieces of Psalm 82 also. So it's really amazing. It's a mind-blowing passage, to say the least, for sure.